Okay, I'm going to start out with just a little bit about Indonesia and then try and explain in a relatively short time a fairly complex book. Currently, the world is 23% Muslim, according to Pew, and in a few more years, it'll be about 1/3 of the population of the world, or 30%. So a big question is what is going to happen in the future, especially given the tensions that we've been experiencing lately. Does anybody here know how many islands there are in Indonesia?
Does anybody know?
17,000. Nobody knows, right. 17,000. Okay, there are a lot of islands in Indonesia. And it's an absolutely gorgeous country with many, many different kinds of cultures and peoples and religions and so on. It's the largest Muslim country in the world. And yet there's a lot of people who are very concerned about what is happening. There's been a rise, an increase in radicalism, increase in polarization, increase in certain kinds of oppression. This was a picture from the demonstration against Ahok, which I think not coincidentally happened 1 week after Trump was elected president in the United States. So in the largest country of the world, the largest Muslim country in the world, with all of the anti-Islamic rhetoric coming out of the United States and out of Europe, there has been a backlash that is a great deal of concern about Muslims being dominated, being oppressed, being marginalized and demonized by people elsewhere. We have some history, especially in the years following the fall of Suharto, of Muslim-Christian conflict. There were about 4 years, from 1998 to 2002, in which there was conflicts all over Indonesia, not just between religious groups, but between ethnic groups, within ethnic groups. They were largely conflicts about control of resources and control of political power. So there were what amounted to civil war between Christians and Muslims in certain parts of Indonesia at that time. This is a mosque nearby a house where I lived for a while. Now, everything we see hides another thing. We always want to see what is hidden by what we see. And this is a quote from René Magritte, and it's sort of the beginning of my book starts with this quote, because I think most Western scholars and most Indonesianists, even Indonesian Indonesianists, very often focus on the rise of radicalism, the rise of intolerance, the rise of conservative Islam in Indonesia, and the eclipse of what used to be called the Abangan, or the less observant Muslims in Indonesia. And I think the focus on that may be really hiding some things that are extremely important for us to pay attention to. My book started, it was somewhat, it's actually before I read Charles Taylor, but I was really inspired and influenced by Charles Taylor's writing about social imaginaries. I was amazed at how his uncovering of Western social imaginaries revealed a lot about the West. And I was fascinated by the fact that in Indonesia, people have a different imagination of what is real than many people do in the West. There are many different kinds of Indonesians and many different kinds of social imaginaries. And my book, in a way, is exploring how do Indonesians from all religions, but especially Muslims, imagine reality. How do they live out their imagination of reality? There's so many different ethnic groups and so many different religious groups that it's very hard to make generalizations. And because of that, almost everybody, every scholar who writes about Indonesia picks one ethnic group, sometimes one village, one island, and hardly anyone dares to write about Indonesia as a whole because of the great diversity. But I've actually been working on the ideas for this book for about 20 years. I've published a number of other books in the meantime, but this is the book I've wanted to write for the last 20 years. And I've spent 2 sabbaticals working on it. And I'm fascinated by the different kind of modernity that exists in Indonesia. This is obviously a mosque, but mixed architecture with a Minangkabau house, right, that's part of the mosque. One of the things that people are dealing with in shaping modernity now is the incredibly rapid pace of social change. You can have people in Indonesia who live in a house like that, whose parents and grandparents never knew electricity or automobiles or any of modern technology that's so familiar to us, and yet now they have a parabola, they're watching CNN, their children are surfing the internet and flying to foreign countries and so on. So how does the sheer speed of social change affect the way people think about and imagine what is real? What is the world that these children will live in 10 years from now? Well, the answer is obviously nobody knows. No one knows, because 10 years ago, nobody could have predicted the world that we live in today. The speed of social change is just almost unbelievable. I have done a lot of thinking about how people imagine modernity, imagine the modern world, not just with ideas, but they use different ways of knowing. Merlin Donald suggested there were 4, he actually suggested 3, an evolution of cognition from mimetic to mythic to theoretic cognition. Theoretic cognition being the dominant way of thinking in the modern world. But mimetic is a way of thinking with our bodies. It's a way of knowing by imitating. It's encased in practices, the practices that we have. I like this picture a lot that I took in Bali, because these Balinese dancers have fused imaginations from the West with the white face and with some of their message, traditional Balinese dress and dance movements, and also Hinduism. And this is very common in Indonesia, the mingling together of things that we don't usually think of as working together. In my book, I suggest that Indonesians have 4 major ways of thinking. They think mimetically. If you solat 5 times a day, you are imagining a certain world with your body. You act out with your body what it means to live in submission to God. Similarly, almost all religious rituals have a mimetic element, the acting out, the experiencing with our bodies. We all think in stories. Mythic cognition is narrative cognition, is thinking in stories. And the stories that are woven together in Indonesia are from many different sources. They're infused with Indian stories, but also from the scriptures, from local traditions, from the village, from adat, and so on. I think probably Indonesia is the most moralistic country I've ever lived in, People think constantly in terms of what is right and what is wrong. I remember once I was fasting in a small village during Ramadan with a young Muslim man and I. We after at the end of the day when the call to prayer came and we could break the fast, we both lit up cigarettes. At that time, this was before I quit, but we both lit up Kretek cigarettes, and I made a comment to him that we probably shouldn't be smoking because it's really bad for our health. And he said, he looked very concerned for a moment, and then he said, but it's not a sin. But it's not a sin, is it? It was a hard question for me to answer. But because I don't think of smoking in those categories. But in Indonesia, everything is halal atau haram, good or evil, permitted or not permitted, and rule-governed behavior is very, very profound. People express with their bodies the way they imagine the world. This was a Malukan king who was greeting the Sultan of Georgetown, and kind of amazing the depth of expression that he put into his greeting. Robert Bellah has written, I think, a wonderful book called Religion and Human Evolution. I have lots of things that I disagree with in the book, but he takes up the theory of Jaspers, who rebelled against the idea that the modern world grew out of the West and was a product of Christianity. And Jaspers suggested that there were 4 major axial civilizations. One was China, a second was India, a third was the Middle East, and the fourth was the Western Greek tradition. So these axial civilizations, according to Bellah, who takes up this theory, these came into being, or they created theoretical means of thinking that led to the modern world between about 800 and 200 BC. So from 800 to 200 BC, you had Confucius and Lao Tzu and other Chinese philosophers who were doing theoretical thinking. You had the Vedas and the Upanishads in India. In Greece, you had Plato and Aristotle. And in the Middle East, during that period, you had the Hebrew prophets. Now, I found Bellah's book, all 1,000 pages of discussion of these 4 axial civilizations and what came before them, because he really starts with the Big Bang and goes forward from there. But I found these ideas very, very useful for thinking about Indonesia, because Indonesia has had literally thousands of years of influence from these 4 civilizations. These 4 civilizations are rooted in Indonesia. You see China everywhere in Indonesia. There's a kind of an irony to the prejudice against Chinese among some Indonesians, because I think almost all Indonesians have Chinese blood. They came over from South China, and now genetic evidence pretty much proves it, that there's Chinese in most Indonesians. But the Indonesia being originally the Spice Islands that were source of fabulous wealth and people coming from all over the world to try and get the spices, it was a crossroads for people from all over. And while European powers fought with each other constantly, Indonesia depended on trade. being 17,000 islands, it depended on trade. And so it developed a long tradition of tolerance. This is Borobudur, for those of you who don't recognize it. It's the largest ancient Buddhist monument in the world. It was built in the 800s AD. And to see Buddhist monks praying before Borobudur is not unusual. It's rather unusual to see a Muslim woman praying with them. But that's not uncommon in Indonesia. It's part of a long tradition of tolerance between peoples. In the 18th century, there were European travelers who came to Indonesia, and they were shocked because in Europe, Catholics could not live in a Protestant village, and vice versa, let alone Muslims or Jews or any other religions. There was a practice of intolerance towards whatever religion was the one in power in a particular place. And they came to Indonesia and found mosques and temples and churches just right next to each other along the streets. So the idea of religious tolerance is not something new that is now being imported from the West to Indonesia. Rather, if anything, intolerance was imported from the West to Indonesia and from elsewhere as well. The incredible, sometimes when I give this talk, I wear a funny hat because I sometimes wear a hat because of someone once asked me, why do you love Indonesia? And I got tired of answering that question after living in Indonesia 27 years. I got tired of answering that question, so I said, I like the funny hats people wear. And it's just a joking answer, but it's actually, there's something deeper behind it. There's an exuberance to Indonesian culture, an exuberance that comes from this mingling of different cultures from all over the world that produces a unique way of imagining. You see, people, villagers, not only wearing traditional hats or traditional headpieces, but wearing everything under the sun, just because it's kind of cool. Many people know Indonesia is the largest Muslim country. Many people don't know that it has a very thriving church. The church has been growing in Indonesia. For the most part, it lives at peace with those around it from all different religions. Many families have both Muslims and Christians in the same family, like my wife here, Farsiana. She's from a family that's mixed, Muslim and Christian, and that's very common. Indonesia protects the right of people to not only practice their own religion, but also to convert. So this is rather unique in the Muslim world. There is a legal right to change your religion in Indonesia. One of the theoretical streams that I'm trying to touch on some of the theoretical streams in the book, but one of the theoretical streams in the book is the idea of disenchantment. Some people have suggested that just as the Protestant Reformation led to disenchantment in Europe by rejecting all superstitions and syncretistic practices and rituals and beliefs in spirits and other powers around them. So in Indonesia, the modernist Islamic movement is in the process of wiping out belief in a sacred cosmos. My book is called Living in a Sacred Cosmos because part of what I wanted to find out is my hypothesis correct that most Indonesians, even those with advanced education, still live in a sacred cosmos rather than in an impersonal universe? Do they live in a reality that they believe is meaningful and surrounded by powers and so on? I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. This is a Hindu shaman, but I lived with a Muslim shaman for 4 months, and it was very interesting to me how he mixed his language. He talked about spirits and magic and evil magic and so on, but he also talked about sin and people were sick because they weren't living right. They were cheating. They were living badly. And he also used modern psychological language, that people were sick because of stress, because various psychological pressures on them. Indonesians are grappling with this rapid social change. I kind of like this picture. It was in the home of Farsiana's, one of her members of her adopted family in the North Moluccas, where she was doing her PhD research. But this young girl is about to go off to university. Her sister is watching TV, quite likely from the West, but not necessarily, because Indonesians also produce a lot of TV. The husband and wife are living in a different world than their children will live in. And so the question is, what is going to happen? One thing that is undeniable in Indonesia is that there is an Islamic renaissance going on. This picture was taken out of my study window in my home. You can see 3 mosques there, but there's probably at least 10 within a few blocks of my house. And there is an incredible flourishing of ideas. There are thousands of books being published that nobody can read outside of Indonesia because they're all in Indonesian. Books about everything under the sun, novels, people dealing with sexual issues and how it relates to their religion, people dealing with modern technology and the way it's changing the way people interact with one another. I teach at Gajah Mada University in Jogja, and they have quite a number of centers and faculties that are just working on Islam and various things. Islamic economics, Islam and politics, Islam and psychology, Islam and literature, so on. There are all these ideas coming out. There's tremendously interesting new architecture and art and music and literature and so on. I wish I had time to write a book about that. Maybe I will someday. But in any case, it's the renaissance of Islam that's going on is something that you won't see if you look at Indonesia through the eyes of fear of Islam. If fear of Islam is your main category, there's an anthropologist who I respect very much, who wrote a book not too recently, but he wrote a book called A Shadow on the Heart of Java, which was a lament. His book is a lament at the eclipse of the Abangan way of life, and it's being replaced by Santri and very much more conservative and pietistic Islam. But I think if you look at Indonesia through the eyes of fear of Islam, you may not see the incredible diversity that there is in Indonesia and the diversity of Islam. Most Christians know that Christianity is endlessly diverse, and they don't feel threatened if some crazy fringe person in Christianity does something in the name of Christ and that doesn't threaten their faith. But many people in the West think that all Muslims are alike, and therefore when there's a terrorist act, there's a fear that all of Islam is like this. This is a picture that I think combines. You have does this work? Yeah. Here you have a traditional mask that's used in dance. Here you have all kinds of advertisements. Susu means milk. Advertisements for different products. Then you have the punk music and motorcycle gang motif. And then you have the young girls posing for their picture with this. This is the world people are living in. It's a mixture of all kinds of different things. These are a few of my students from Muhammadiyah University that were over at my house. Every semester I come home and I say to my wife, honey, we have 70 or 80 students coming for dinner. And she says, great. So we get all of the furniture out of our house, and they all pack into the house and we have dinner together. But it's just incredible to see these young people and their openness and their hunger to learn and their grappling with how to be a positive force in the world. It's a great honor for me to be able to teach them and to be able to follow them. A lot of them write to me after the classes are over and tell me what they're doing. And I had one student this recently wrote to me, and he was my favorite student. And he started out always wearing the super conservative, quote unquote, radical Islam clothing. But he always sat up in the front, and he always asked a lot of questions, and he read everything. And he was really thinking. And he recently wrote to me and said, I don't know what I'm going to do. You won't be here next semester. So, well, my research project was to test a number of different hypotheses, but one of them was, do Indonesians inhabit a sacred cosmos? What is the impact of Islamic modernism, rationalism, scripturalism on disenchantment? Is Indonesia being disenchanted the way Europe was? I had a series of grants, but the most important one was from Ford Foundation that enabled me with my wife, who's an anthropologist, to travel around Indonesia. We interviewed people from around 50 different ethnic groups. We distributed 2,492 questionnaires. I was trying to find out if my hypotheses and thinking about Indonesia, which was backed by lots of stories and experience with Indonesians, if it could be demonstrated to be not just Java, but from around Indonesia and so on. I can't go into the details. You can find them out in my book. But I posited 4 characteristics of a sacred cosmos. The first one is that individuals are embedded in communities, in extended families. This is my wife with her extended family, the family she was doing research with in North Maluku. 3 generations living under the same roof. And it's amazing. We've just had this horrible earthquake in Sulawesi. And I know when we had a really terrible earthquake in Georgetown, where I live, where 6,000 people died, the day of the earthquake, the thing that struck me the most was that when I went around the city on my motorcycle to see the conditions, I didn't see anybody alone. Everybody were in groups. They were all helping one another. And it's kind of amazing to see. I wonder about the situation in Palu and Donggala now, because the media tells about rioting and stealing from stores and so on. And I wonder if that's the major story, because that's the kind of story the media will tell you. They won't tell you about the people helping each other out, the people searching for their loved ones, risking their own lives to help their neighbors. Those kind of stories don't get into the media very much, and they are often the dominant thing going on. But if one person robs a store because they're hungry, then that will become the headlines in the news. Part of that individuals being rooted in communities is that communities are not limited to the living. Communities include the ancestors, and many Indonesians live with a strong conviction that their ancestors are all around them. This, of course, is part of a lot of the local indigenous religions in Indonesia, but it's also broadly, widely believed by people from all religious groups, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, and so on. These actually are tau, which are statues, wooden carved statues of the ancestors of one of my students who just got her PhD in studying collective memory among the Torajans. And the ancestors are not the only part of the community. There's also powers in nature. There's also spirits. There's also other kinds of powers that surround us, that are part of our community. Nature has agency, and we need to maintain balance with it. The second part of a sacred community is a sacred cosmos, is that communities are embedded in nature. Nature has agency. Almost all ethnic groups in Indonesia and all religious groups in Indonesia have all kinds of rituals that are meant to guard balance with the surrounding nature, that are meant to keep us living in harmony with nature around us. And many times, many Indonesians believe that when there are disasters, it's because there is a lack of balance. There's a lack of harmony in our relationship to nature. Nature is embedded in a moral order. Number 3, not an impersonal universe, but rather a cosmos which is construed as part of a larger moral order. This volcano is right behind my house, and I didn't take this picture, but I saw this picture a number of times, and it always reminds me of a time in, I think, 1997, 1996 or 97, I believe it was 1997, when I was invited to a birthday party for Romo Mangunwijaya, whom some of you have probably heard of. Romo Mangun was a Jesuit priest who was widely revered among all religions in Indonesia for his work on behalf of the poor, and also for his architecture, his novels, his historical works, and so on. But at the birthday party at my friend's house, they were talking about the eruption of the volcano, and one of the members at the party was Gus Dur, Abdurrahman Wahid, who later became president. And Gus Dur and the other people around there, they were talking about what is the meaning of the eruption of the volcano. I thought this was kind of weird, but they seemed to be convinced that it was a sign. It was a sign that Suharto was going to fall. And they suggested that Gus Dur was Samar, that he was God incarnate, which is, Samar is a God incarnate who is in the form of a fat, short, ugly guy who's really funny. He's a joker. He's a joker. He's always cracking jokes, and often inappropriate jokes. He talks in coarse, low language, and he's the favorite of Javanese. Javanese love Samar, and he's in all of the stories. He's a creation of Java. He's in the stories from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, but he was invented in Java. Well, what does it mean? I don't think they were saying that the volcano erupting will cause the fall of Suharto. They were saying that it's a sign. It's a sign from God that Suharto is going to fall. Now, I don't know what to make of it, but less than a year later, Suharto fell, and Gus Dur became president. So the prophecy that was made that night in that living room with these Indonesian intellectuals, mostly Muslims, but some Christians, several having PhDs from foreign universities. They believed, I felt like I was in a Shakespearean play, because in Shakespeare, you know, the elements always sort of match what's happening in the political order. Fourthly, the moral order is embedded in God, or the transcendent. The moral order is personal and meaningful. So if nature is part of a moral order that's linked to the social order, the moral order is linked or is founded in God. I use this picture on the front of my book because I think it sort of captures this sense of worship to God in the midst of a cosmos that is meaningful. Of course, not all Indonesians believe in spirits and in miracles and in dreams and in the meaning in natural events. There's every kind of belief and practice in the world in Indonesia. I was struck by these three, since I studied with Bob Bella and had many arguments with him about second naivete. I was interested to learn of it in Indonesia. This guy in the middle, he didn't believe any of it. He's a Catholic priest, and he just said, you know, belief in spirits and supernatural events and meaning in natural events and dreams and all that stuff, it's incompatible with modern science and rationality. He said, I just don't believe it. I asked him if he still practiced some of the rituals for maintaining balance in the cosmos. He said, of course. If I didn't, my parishioners would be upset. But it's functional. It's something useful, but it's not real. Next to him, this guy, also a priest, also have a PhD from Rome, believes all of it. He's convinced that we're surrounded by powers and spirits, and he has many stories to tell about it, and he's sure it's true, and it's also useful, but it's not only just useful, it's real. He believes with the first naivete, if you like. He believes without doubt that this is true. The third one was the rector, and in his opinion, well, maybe not, not sure, sort of believe, half not believe. And I find that these three guys, I find them repeated in many of my students, those who are very absolutely sure and those who really do not believe, and probably a growing number who have that second naivete, who believe with part of their being. So where is Indonesia and the world going? What is the future? I have no idea. So if you are interested in my book and you want to find that out, you won't find that out in the book. I have a lot of hope for the future of Indonesia. I think there's a lot of hope for the influence of Indonesia on the rest of the world. Part of the reason Indonesia does not have a high public profile is because you never hear about it except when there's a disaster or there's violence. But Indonesia in 1955 had a life expectancy of 37 years. 37 years. Today, life expectancy in Indonesia is 73 years. In 1955, literacy was 15%. Only a small elite could read and write. Today, it's 93%, probably higher than the United States. And among young people, it's 99%. So there's been a tremendous change in prosperity, in education, in health care, and so on. And I think as time goes by, Indonesia is going to have a greater and greater influence on Islam and on the rest of the world. Because Indonesians, many Indonesians, are not ashamed of Indonesian Islam. If anything, they think it's superior to Middle Eastern Islam. They do not think that Islam needs to be cleansed from all traditions and cultural expressions. They think that it needs to be preserved and strengthened, and that the tradition of living in tolerance and openness, there's a lot of talk about Islam is meant to be a blessing to the world. And that is, my colleagues, my Muslim colleagues are committed to that, seeing Islam as a blessing to the whole world and not something that people should be afraid of. My conclusion is people are not syncretizing or unifying tradition, religion, and science, but holding them in tension. Indonesians shift their symbol systems. They talk in religious language in certain contexts. They talk in scientific or modern language in other contexts. And they talk in traditional language in other contexts. Humans use multiple ways for understanding and making sense of reality. Truth is not defined by cognition or by theoretic cognition. Truth can be perceived through different ways of knowing. These include mimetic rituals, myths or stories, ethics, and science. The four axial civilizations that lay the foundation for the modern world are all deeply a part of Indonesia, but Indonesia has not become one with any of them. It's not part of China. It's not part of the Sinosphere. It's not part of India, even though it was called the Dutch East Indies. It's not part of Europe, and it's not part of the Middle East. It's its own creation, which has, I think, something to offer to the rest of the world. The great crises of our age, these are not all of them, of course, but some of them include the domination of Western theoretical modes of thought. Scientific truth is the only truth. My colleague Bob Bella, before his untimely death, he told me in his study that he was very pessimistic, and he thought that the domination of theoretic cognition in the West would lead to the extinction of the human species. I'm not quite as pessimistic as that, but certainly this is not the only way we know things. Secondly, the religious reaction of dogmatism, polarization, conflict, and violence is equally serious. Thirdly, the renewal of ethnic chauvinism, fascism, and exclusivism. And fourthly, the environmental crises, which are destroying the earth for future generations. We need all four modes of knowledge to address these crises, not just one. I think Indonesians have much to teach the world. This is a quote from Anthony Reid. Indonesians have much to teach the world about the civilized and dynamic coexistence of multiple worldviews, both in ourselves and in complex societies. We in ourselves use different kinds of knowing. And how do we make sense of them without becoming schizophrenic? I think this is part of the offering of Indonesia for us. So I hope some of you will get my book. And if any of you are interested in reading it and reviewing it, I'd be happy to have a complimentary copy sent to you by Yale. If you'd like to buy one, today I have some that I can sell for $25. They sell for $28 from Amazon or from Yale. So until they all run out, you're welcome. You're welcome to them. Do we have some time for questions?
I have a question. The theme of diversity, which you stress in your observation, how much is it a source of confusion, or as opposed to the sort of general acceptance? I don't know if my question is clear.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a source of confusion sometimes. But Indonesians have, sometimes I despair at their ability to think holistically and not analytically. So part of what I'm trying to teach my students is to be disturbed by contradictions instead of just accepting them, and to think critically and analytically and not just accept this and accept this and accept this and that and just not think clearly. So students who are grappling with modern analytic ways of thinking are more likely to be disturbed by contradictions or tensions. But most Indonesians, for example, Indonesia has a pluralistic law system. They have adat law, which is traditional law. They have religious law, which is from Islamic law. And they have modern national law. And they will say, legal experts will say repeatedly that these are not in conflict. They are complementary. Well, you look at them and sometimes they are in conflict. But they figure out a way to, compromise, find compromises between different laws that are meant for different things. And they will use a modern law and justify it with an adat law or a religious law. They have a lot of different ways of bringing things together. But the thing that I find most striking is that they do not see as much as we do, or as much as Western educated people do, the problem of contradiction. They think dialectically much more. Not necessarily synthetically with making a synthesis, but dialectically. This is true in this context, and something else is true in another context. And we should respect both.
Well, the 4 principles, or 5 principles of Pancasila, are they still a guiding principle?
Yeah, Pancasila, for those of you who don't know, Indonesian national ideology, which is the opening of the Constitution, is that there is one great unity of deity, many different religions, but one God, or one great transcendent power over all of us. And they define that to include all the different religions. Secondly, there is one humanity, different races, different ethnic groups, but there's only one humanity. So we are all brothers and sisters under the one God, even though we don't agree about that God. Thirdly, there is one Indonesia that is made up of all these different ethnic groups, that has a common history of thousands of years, and has been a political unity at times over these thousands of years. And there is one nation that should be held together in spite of differences in ideology and race and so on. Fourthly, the sovereignty of the people, that the people are sovereign, that they should be ruled by a representative government that represents them and in which everyone's voice can be heard. And then fifthly, social justice for all Indonesians. Pancasila is sort of made a comeback. It had a period after the fall of Suharto, because Suharto had misused Pancasila so much to justify whatever his agenda was that many people were kind of disillusioned. But I think Pancasila has made a comeback. It's Jokowi, the president, outlawed any organization that is working against Pancasila. And on that basis, he outlawed Hizbut Tahrir, because Hizbut Tahrir believes in a worldwide Khalifa, and so is against the one nation of Indonesia. So, yeah, I think it's somewhat, you see a lot of slogans and billboards, and it's repeated in speeches. It seems to be much more prominent now than it was for a while. But there's also opposition to it, from especially from the more from the right wing, those who don't think Indonesia should be a Pancasila state. They think it should be an Islamic state. But that is still a very small minority of Indonesian Muslims.
I'm wondering about the concept of the community being embedded in nature. So I think there's some very big cities, so I'm not an expert, so there's a urbanization happening. And how does this affect this link to nature, which bears that moral code, which connects to the transcendent? So if you're living in a big city, nature may not be so obvious.
It's a good question. Indonesia has the fastest rate of urbanization of any country in Asia, faster than China and India, and the highest rate of urbanization of any country. It's amazing. Since I moved there in 1991, the changes that have taken. So urbanization, in the growth, Indonesia's like number 2 in the world in Twitter use, not one of its more not one of the things that it should be proud of, but a reality that everybody has cell phones and everybody uses social media. I have one chapter in my book about nature and natural disasters, and it has statistical evidence. Most of my informants, of the 2,492 who filled out the questionnaire, most of them are young people, under 40. So it's a sample of the young. All of them believe we should be preserving nature, and most of them believe, a majority believe, that harmony and living in harmony with nature is very important. Indonesia has a very vigorous environmental movement. There's a lot of NGOs. In fact, the first and most powerful NGOs during the Suharto era were environmental NGOs, because they weren't as obviously political, and so they could go under the radar of his repression. So Indonesians are in principle very concerned about the environment, but urbanization definitely is changing their relationship to nature. Especially on Java, which is so densely populated. So how many believe that nature is embedded in a moral order? I think I have statistics on that. But my statistics are not clear, because the statistics in my book are, I'm looking at how they use symbolic languages. I'm not pigeonholing them. So the answers are not mutually exclusive. So if they say we should use science to fix the problems of nature, that doesn't mean they don't believe we should live in harmony with nature, for example. So I'm not trying to nail down how many people believe this and how many. I'm trying to see how they use different symbolic systems to describe what they think is most important. What is the most important thing? And all of them say, anyway, that the nature should be revered and so on. But how they have changed, I don't have any base group from 20 years ago to compare them with, so I can't really, I have my suspicions. I'd be happy to share with you what I think, but I don't have any hard evidence. There was one back there first. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you speak to any specific difficulties that Indonesians who don't identify with one of the six state-recognized religions face with regard to their religious freedom? Like, have you witnessed anything in this regard, like the discrimination towards believers of the Baha'i faith in 2000?
Yeah. Thank you. It's a good question. I am often asked if there is religious persecution, oppression of minorities in Indonesia, and my immediate answer is there racism in America? I mean, of course, there is discrimination, there is oppression, there is persecution, there are minority groups that until this day cannot return to their homes because they've been driven out of their villages. There's Shia that have been had their homes burned down and driven out of their homes. There's Ahmadis who have probably been oppressed the most. There are Christians in heavily Muslim areas that have a difficult time, that have to be very, very careful not to offend anybody. There was a woman recently who complained about the azan, the call to prayer, that the speakers were too loud, that were next to her house, and she complained to her neighbor about this just while they were buying something, and the story got distorted, that she was saying they should do away with the azan, and she was anti-Islam, and the story got distorted. The woman she was talking to talked to her husband, who talked to somebody else, and you know how these stories go. So then it spread on the social media, and her house was burned down. And then she was sentenced to 2 years in prison. And then all of the Islamic organizations in Indonesia protested that this was a travesty of injustice. Minority groups are, but you can hear this kind of story of things that happen to Muslims in America or African Americans or other minorities in America. In Indonesia, it's against the law to discriminate. It's against the law to discriminate, but there is a law against defaming religion. So this woman was sentenced for defaming religion, which was not true. And all of the major Muslim leaders in Indonesia came out to defend her and protest her sentence and say that this was a travesty. Complaining about the loudness of a loudspeaker is not defaming religion. So, yeah, there is oppression of minorities in Indonesia, but it is isolated and not widespread. It's against the law. There is another well-known case where a young former Muslim from Minang made a blog site called Minang Atheist, an atheist from Minang, which is a heavily Muslim area, and he also got prosecuted and sentenced to jail for a couple of years, but he wasn't sentenced for being an atheist, which he was. He wasn't sentenced for being an atheist. He was sentenced for defaming the Prophet, for saying bad things about the Prophet. And that is on the law. Now, some of my Muslim friends have worked very hard to try to do away with the law against defaming religion. Most of my colleagues, Muslim intellectuals, don't think there should be a law against defaming religion because it's always used against minorities. Nobody's ever sentenced for defaming Christianity or Hinduism or anything else. It's always used by those who are powerful to oppress the people they don't like. So my Muslim colleagues would like it to be, and it was reviewed by the Constitutional Court, and it was upheld. So unfortunately, it's still on the books. Okay, yeah.
Hi, many of your talks are very interesting. On this idea of living in a sacred cosmos, do you think elites in Indonesia, or maybe the former elites, have kind of tried to protect this idea of living in a sacred cosmos, while many Muslims living in Indonesia, many young people have kind of changed their views? And on the Islamic modernists, do you think are challenging this kind of sacred cosmos that's maybe part of the larger Indonesian tradition? Do you think they're informed by the fact that, education has increased, there's access to social media, there's access to knowledge from, everything from Egypt all the way to Malaysia and everything in between? And corollary to that, do you think they see themselves as not living in a sacred cosmos? Or do they just define that sacred cosmos differently?
Your question started out about the elite using sacred cosmos type of beliefs as
talking about the president, former president. And I know some elites have talked about they don't like the kind of growing conservatism.
yeah. Well, the government is usually pushing science and theoretical knowledge. The influence of modern capitalism on Indonesia is overwhelming. The most people, their myths and stories are more likely from Hollywood and media like that than they are from traditional myths of their ancestors. So the young people whom I surveyed tend to be, they are very, very different. So almost nobody believes in everything. One thing that was interesting to me was that I had one very explicit question that asked, what is your experience of hidden powers and beings and so on around you? And one answer was, I frequently have communication with these beings. I frequently experience them. This is an everyday thing for me. And second question wasn't exact, it was better formed than that. But second answer was, I experience God in my life. I experience miracles and maybe the protection of angels or of God's presence in my life. And the third was, I don't believe in hidden beings or secret unseen beings, spirits, ghosts, and so on. It's better, we should use rationality and science to solve the mysteries of humankind. What was interesting to me was that maybe 40% of the answers, or 35% of the people who gave the rationalist answer, the majority gave the religious answer, but those who gave the rationalist answer, of them, the great majority believe in spirit possession. So on another question asking, how would you interpret if somebody loses consciousness and starts talking with a different voice and so on? Is this evil? Is this an evil spirit and you should call a religious leader to evict them? Or is this just spirit possession and a shaman can help? Might be an ancestor or something? Or is this a psychological phenomena of people being mass hysteria or psychological problems?
But you can be a super rationalist. Would say that when you're dealing with dimensions of the transcendent, the approach to the transcendent is not through rationality, but rather it's through, and that's why you've got a real movement in many religious traditions in terms of forms of meditation, etc., which they would affirm experientially leads to X. I think part of the problem is that we in our whole system have defined being modern in such a super rationalist way that it's not like you say, sure, be super rationalist when it comes to dealing with, quote, empirical material, but when you're talking about other dimensions of reality that are beyond, you have rationalism is a defective agent.
Yeah, that's well taken. Yeah.
Professor, you have drawn a very domestic picture of Indonesian society and the Indonesia itself, and I find it very impressive to read this book actually, because it explores a lot of a country which is not known to many of us, But I want also to understand, you have mentioned in your presentation that Indonesia has been through like difficult times where people were fighting each other, where it was a country on the verge of civil war. But how the country transformed from this transition of being in a civil war to a peaceful society, and how do you assess that? What is your assessment to the extremism in the society in Indonesia? And I mean not only the Islamic extremism, but extremism in general, even for the non-believers or those who are not Muslims in society.
Okay.
And this will have to be the last one because we've got a class coming.
Okay, could maybe we have one woman who's had her hand up, and I'll go to her after that. Just a very quick answer, because your question needs a few hours to answer. Most scholars would say that the period of chaos, they call it Edan, the period of chaos in Indonesia was a transition period from an authoritarian militaristic government. Suharto was in power for 32 years. He was a general and he controlled the military, and he did not allow dissent, and he did not allow difference. So he was not totalitarian, but he really repressed, he really did not allow anything that could lead to conflict. You weren't even allowed to talk about conflict. So when he fell and there was a decentralization of power and the military was removed from power, and democracy supposedly was instituted, then suddenly there was all kinds of conflicts that had been smoldering for a long time, for decades. They all came to the surface, and then there was a lot of uncertainty about what was going to happen. Some people, there was a lot of fake news, rumors, a lot of fear. There was never civil war for the whole country. There was never, but there were islands where people separated out on ethnic or religious basis to try to defend themselves against what they perceived as a severe threat to their future. So we haven't had any mass violence since 2002. We've had violence, but just isolated instances. So, but I could talk a long time about this question, but we don't have time. So I do want to recognize that. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I know several years ago, and this may not be the case now, but there was a lot of concern about the influence of the Wahhabi sect of Islam, and particularly the efforts of Saudi Arabia to sort of push that particular set of beliefs through sending textbooks to schools in Indonesia. And I'm just wondering if this is still a concern there, and also perhaps a larger question, how you see the sort of the prognosis for a more accepting and tolerant view of Islam really becoming more accepted in Indonesia rather than these conservative strains.
Okay, quick answer, since that's all I have time for. In my book I say I'm not optimistic and I'm not pessimistic, but I'm very hopeful. Okay, I'm very hopeful. I really think that 10 years from now, no one knows what the world's going to look like. I think that the huge demonstrations against the Christian Chinese governor, Ahok, 500 to 700,000 people demonstrating against him, was part of the reaction to what happened to the election of Trump. So what happens in America, what happens in Europe, what happens in the Middle East, it all has an impact on Indonesia. And I think there are circulations of influence, and that Indonesia is going to have more and more influence as time goes by in other parts of the world. So I'm hopeful that Indonesia will weather the challenges. Right now, the Wahhabi influence is clear that it's there. There are the current monarch in Saudi Arabia came to Indonesia, 2 years ago, and he loved it so much he stayed for 10 times longer than he had planned. I don't know if Indonesia is having an influence on Saudi Arabia. The number of people who actually follow Wahhabi teaching is fairly small. It's still a relatively small number, but the influence of money is definitely there. They are giving money and building things, but Indonesia is too, as I said, for 2,000 years, it has resisted becoming an extension of the Dutch or of India or of China. It has maintained its own unique characteristic, and I don't think that's going to change. So I'm hopeful, but I really don't know what the future will hold. So one thing that is interesting is that in all of the elections that we have had, radical Islam or very conservative Islamic parties have all done badly. So most Indonesians vote for non-religious parties. And it doesn't mean they're not pious. They are pious, but they don't want one party to tell them what being a good Muslim means, because there's so much diversity between them that they want to retain that freedom. So the secular parties outdo each other trying to show their piety. But they are, and the most conservative, the most radical Islamic party in Indonesia, which is PKS, it denies that it's interested in enforcing Sharia. So it's the Indonesians are they don't want a political party or a particular group to tell them what to do. Muhammadiyah, with something like 30 to 40 million people, members, and Nahdlatul Ulama, NU, with 50 to 60 million members, they claim, they no longer, even as Muhammadiyah cannot speak with a single voice, they can't tell people how to vote, because if you have 30 to 40 million members, there's going to be a tremendous amount of diversity there. And if you tell people that they should vote for one group, then, Amin Rais learned that to his chagrin when he didn't do nearly as well. Most Muhammadiyah members didn't vote for his party. The same is true of NU. There's everything. NU is one of the things that is interesting, and I have one chapter that I interview in depth 2 leaders from Muhammadiyah, 2 leaders from NU, and 2 leaders that are independent intellectuals, all Muslims. And they all break the stereotypes. The NU ones are not like NU. Well, one of them is, but the other one is not. The Muhammadiyah members are not like the stereotype. So you can't prove anything from 6 interviews, but those interviews are a very interesting picture of the difference of views of Muslims. They're all Muslims who are part of major streams within Indonesia, but are not by no means cookie cutter representatives of those streams.
As you can see, this was a very stimulating discussion. We have a lot of questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.